We're going to very shortly read the Bible together. We're going to learn a little bit about a guy called Jacob. So I'll give you some background information and then we'll jump in. So Jacob in the Bible is the grandson of Father Abraham. Abraham, the guy that God picked out of obscurity and then made this incredible promise and said, I'm going to make a nation out of you. It's going to bless all nations. So Jacob is actually a twin. When Jacob's mum realized that there was two little babies in her womb and that they were wrestling and fighting all the time, she went and got some advice. And this prophecy was said over her children that the younger one's actually going to end up being the boss. The older one's going to serve the younger one, which is the total opposite of how things usually worked at this time. Usually when a child is born, the firstborn ends up being the caretaker of the family moving forward. They get a double share of all the inheritance, but they're also going to be the one that's responsible and in charge of this family. So when the time comes to give birth, out comes baby number one, and his name is Esau. And very closely behind comes baby number two. Baby number two is actually holding on to the heel of Esau. Holding on, gripping. And babies actually have really strong hands. I think I've heard that a baby can actually hold on, can take their own weight on like a monkey bars or whatever. Don't try it, but that's what I've heard. So, they name Jacob, and Jacob means heel grabber. And it kind of has some really interesting connotations to it. Jacob meaning heel grabber, but someone who grabs your heel is going to trip you over. So Jacob kind of means deceiver at the same time. So something that is probably really important for you to know and me to know is never trust anyone by the name of Jacob. Ever. Not true. Jacob has, if Jacob had a motto in life, right? His motto, not this Jacob, we're not talking about him anymore, okay? He's a good guy. Jacob in the Bible, if he had a motto for his life, it would be, I'm going to get mine no matter what it takes. And Jacob, he fell into some interesting methods to get blessing and to get inheritance. He tricked his brother into giving him his birthright, that position as firstborn. He also tricked his father into passing on the family blessing onto Jacob. And this is not a small blessing. This is that big blessing that God gave to Abraham a generation prior. So Jacob, after he's done this, he's tricked his brother. He's then tricked his father. His brother says, I'm going to kill you, Jacob. You're done. So Jacob has to flee and runs away. He goes out and stays with his uncle for a number of years. He continues to try and trick and deceive, but also ends up getting tricked and deceived himself. But in the end, he ends up having quite a successful farming business. He has a couple of wives and he has 11 children. And he thinks, all right, it's time to go back to meet my brother. It's time to face the music. And that is where we're going to begin reading from here, from Genesis 32. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Okay? When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that the hip was wrenched, and he wrestled with the man. And the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go until you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. And the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. First thing that I'd like to tell you that's going to make a difference in your life is Jacob met with God when he was alone. His family, his possessions, everyone else had already crossed to the other side of the river. He was finally left alone. It was quiet. His Netflix subscription had run out. The Wi-Fi reception was really poor. There was nothing happening here. And in the dark, when he was on his own, he had an encounter with the God of the universe that changed the trajectory of his life. You and I live incredibly noisy lives. It is very, very easy for you and I to fill every single waking second of our day with a screen or a sound or with a distraction or a conversation or anything, right? It is incredibly easy for us to wake up in the morning, check social media, work on screens whilst listening to music, listen to podcasts in the car, or get home. We turn the TV on at the first possible chance we can until we're too tired to do that. Then we lay in bed and then we sit on our phones until our eyes are falling down to sleep, and then we go to sleep. And the first thing that wakes us up in the morning is our phone again, and then we start the cycle again and again. God is waiting for space. God is waiting for silence, and God is waiting for us to give him a moment to use. I think that God has something powerful ready to give to you personally if you would just carve a little bit of time every day to be alone with him. God spoke to him. God worked in him when he was alone. So, what are you going to do about it? So, can I just put out here that this is probably one of the weirdest stories in the Bible. It's really weird, yeah? Do you think so? This guy, in the middle of the night, he wrestles with God all night. And I kind of wish that there was more detail in the Bible, because I was thinking about how this wrestle started, right? It's nighttime, you might have your fire, and you've got your cloak or whatever you're sleeping in. You're probably using a rock as a pillow, which Jacob did at times. And then, out of nowhere, this man appears. And Jacob doesn't seem to know that it's God, right? And then they wrestle. Do you reckon that maybe God rocked up and Jacob was like, oh my gosh, this guy has been sent by my brother. He's going to try and kill me. And then they start to wrestle there? Or maybe it was more of a friendly thing where God come up and was like, Jacob, let's wrestle, bruh. Let's do it. My own theory is that God came out and God was wearing one of those Mexican wrestling masks and the spandex. So it was really clear to Jacob that it was time to go. God gets another mask, another thing, goes, suit up, Jacob. Let's do this. Anyway, he wrestled with Jacob, and that is weird, right? We don't know how this wrestle started, but God actually talks about prayer. In the Bible, prayer is referenced as a wrestle. In Colossians 4, when the writer of Colossians is referring to all the different people that are looking after this church and looking out for them, he says, greetings from your friend Epaphras. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. If we look at this wrestle, right, we're going to find that there's some powerful lessons about prayer for us. So the first thing I'd like to say about wrestling that is very applicable to prayer is that wrestling is a two-player thing. No one is lining up to go and watch the solo wrestling championships of the world. It would not work. It would not be interesting. It would be zero. No one would ever want to see that, because wrestling does not work if there's only one person wrestling. Not at all. It does not ever work that way. I think that sometimes we pray, we have a walk with God that is one person wrestling. We send our prayers to God, right? Like we're sending a letter to Santa, where it's like, hey God, I need you to do this. See ya. Prayer is a two-person thing. Sometimes we live our walk with God where God, you can come and make my life better. You can come and give me comfort. You can come and give me stuff. You can come and make things better for me, and we'll leave it there. We'll put a big full stop after that, God. Jacob wrestled with God. When you're wrestling with someone, you both have the same goal. You are both there to overpower, to fight, and win this battle. Only one person wins a wrestling match, and it doesn't work unless there's two people there. My challenge for you is, do you listen to God? Do you let him push you around? Do you let him be part of your actual day-to-day life, or is it just you in the driver's seat? Is there listening time? Is there pause time, right? When we read the Bible, when we come to parts that we don't really gel with, when we come to parts that maybe are contrary to the current cultural moment that we live in, we skip straight over them, or we explain them away very often. There's a temptation to do that. But God is welcoming you and I into prayer that is as much about what he wants to say as what you might want to say. He's inviting you into prayer that is an actual exchange and communication both ways between you and the God who created you. Prayer is a two-player game. Bear with me. It's the first time I've ever used this kind of technology. A 5-year-old iPad. The next thing about prayer is, the next thing about wrestling is wrestling exposes your weaknesses, right? If Johnny and I wrestle, I know what Johnny's injuries are that he's dealt with over the last few years, right? So after we've been wrestling for a couple of hours, I know where I'm going to start throwing a couple of jabs in, right? If I'm sore, right, and I'm wrestling someone, if I've got a bad shoulder, this is going to be exposed because we're going to be rolling around, pushing, pulling. Every little part of my body is going to be tested and strained and exhausted by the time I've wrestled for 5 minutes, let alone wrestling all night, right? Prayer exposes your weaknesses to God. Real prayer, life-changing prayer with God is when you take not just the good moments, not just the requests, not just when things are all fine and dandy, but you actually take yourself to God and say, God, this is really me. This is really me. I'm actually struggling with this. This is what my desires are. This is what my history makes me think. This is what my trauma looks like and feels like. God, this is the real me. Would you like to please interact with this me? Not the me that I showed everyone else. Not the me that I put on social media. Not the me that's not real. Real prayer, real wrestling exposes your weaknesses, and it's not just for the rosy, good, happy days. The third thing about wrestling is agony. I was chatting to my friend at work who does amateur jiu-jitsu tournaments, right? And I said, how long is a round? It'd be so exhausting. He goes, usually 2.5 minutes. And he said, but sometimes there's ones that don't have round limits. So they might be 15 minutes and they are insane. People are so exhausted, right? Can you imagine wrestling someone all night? Hours and hours and hours of wrestling, right? Wrestling is like you lifting weights, but the weights are actually pushing and pulling you in all random directions. This is agony, right? That verse before I mentioned about Epaphras wrestling in prayer, the Greek word that we've got wrestling from is, I know nothing about Greek pronunciation, but it's agonizomos or agonizomos, right? It's the word that we get agony from. Wrestling with God, praying with God, actually having a relationship with the God of the universe sometimes doesn't feel like play fighting. Sometimes it feels like you're in agony. And if we look at the Lord's Prayer, right? The Lord's Prayer has agony in every single line if we actually pray those words, right? Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? There's agony in actually glorifying God instead of glorifying ourselves. There's agony in living a life that's actually based about Him instead of for ourselves. Give us our daily bread, right? It's actually a strain and a struggle and a stretch for us to not seek to provide for ourselves, to get more and more and more and hold on to what we've got, but to say, God will supply my daily bread, and what I've got, I'm content with. There is agony in seeking forgiveness from God and letting Him see the real thing. There's agony in actually forgiving other people. There is stretch and there's strain in the type of prayer that Jesus prescribed for us. It's not a cakewalk. And the biggest example and the best example I can give about this kind of agony, this kind of difficulty, right, actually comes from the other guy in the Bible who wrestled with God all night. It actually happened twice, right? First time, Jacob. The second time was in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus took his 11 disciples in the middle of the night, the day before he was about to be crucified and take the whole weight of sin on his shoulders the next day, right? Jesus was in absolute anguish. He was in pain. He was exhausted. He takes his disciples. He takes his 3 closest disciples, and then he goes further on his own, and he falls flat on his face in front of them. And here he prays in the dark the whole night. He's under so much strain and stress that he's sweating blood. And you know what kind of prayer Jesus prays when he's in this place, in this strain, in this struggle? He prays the same type of prayer that he told us to pray. He says, he gives his request to God and says, God, if there's a way that you can take this pain, take this thing away from me, or find another way, but God, not my will, but your will be done. When he comes back to his disciples and they're all asleep, he says, I pray that you won't fall into temptation. Jesus prays the exact type of prayer in the lowest of low moments as he does when things are all good and all wonderful. The type of prayer God is prescribing for you and me, this wrestle, this two-player, this to and fro, this struggle that exposes our weaknesses is applicable for every single moment of your life. And Jesus, our wonderful God, our amazing King, showed us this example, right? He showed us what it means to be weak and to be lost and to be on your face in front of God. But the amazing thing about Jesus in this moment is Jesus prayed all alone, everyone is asleep. But after he's finished praying, right, he gets up, he wakes up his disciples and says, all right, it's go time. And from that point, there's no sign of weakness or doubt. There is just the greatest example of self-control and strength that's ever has been or ever will be displayed on the earth. If you go to God in real prayer, there will be an exchange. There will be resiliency, there will be strength, there will be power that God is just itching to give to you. Does our prayer life right now reflect that we actually believe this would happen? Or do we think prayer is just another thing you say and you throw around? That's the question. But, right, what about for all of us people that have stopped praying? What about for all of us, those people here who have prayed that loved ones would be healed but they've died? What about for those of us who have strained and struggled just like Jesus did, and we've got no's or we've got silence? Or what about those of us who've prayed things and we know it's things that God cares about, and we still haven't had an answer to those prayer? That's how people are feeling right now. God has something that he wants to say to you if you're in that scenario. The book of Revelation, as Kevin mentioned just before, the book of Revelation was this, God spoke to this guy called John, right, when he was on an island. And then the book of Revelation was written, and it was to be like a letter that was taken around to all of these churches to give them specific messages for that time. And when you look at all the symbolism and stuff like that in the Bible, so much of that actually has direct implications to the things that those people were experiencing. There's some doubt about when Revelation was written and which emperor was in charge of that region, but it doesn't matter what one of these emperors, of the possible emperors, they're all atrocious towards the Christians. The people that received the book of Revelation were going under incredible persecution, martyrdom, torture, businesses destroyed, people fleeing. The people that had the book of Revelation read to them, right, they would have been people who had loved ones who had been killed. They would have been people who had prayed all night, who had struggled and strained, and still the oppression and the injustice was continuing. And in the book of Revelation, as it comes to your town, right, you get to Revelation 6, verse 10. And it mentions the people who have been killed, right, calling out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Can you imagine being in church, being in this home church, right? And this is the thing that's read out in the book of Revelation. That's exactly what I've been praying out. That's exactly what my family have been praying out for the last few years, that God, you would actually do something, that you would avenge us, that you would bring justice Where is it? It hasn't come. But as Revelation continues, we get to a really amazing scene, right? And I'm going to read it from Revelation 8. And Revelation 8 is in direct response to these prayers. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hands. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it onto the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. If you were in this church and you heard this written, right, you would know that the incense was often the representation of the unceasing, ongoing prayers of the people. You would know that your prayers is what's being referenced here. And you would know that this altar that's being referenced to is the altar of God where sacrifices are made. When you read ask, seek, and knock, right, it's not ask once, it's not seek once, it's not knock once. When Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer, right, it's followed by this passage. And God says, come in and make this your everyday. Make asking, make seeking, make knocking your every day. Now and forever, your whole life, God is inviting you to make a change that makes prayer the center of it. When it's hard, when it's easy, when things are going wrong, when there's distractions, God is asking you and inviting you to ask, to seek, and to knock. So what's our response to this book going to be? Are we going to go back to not praying? Are we going to be distracted? Or is this going to actually change our trajectory? Is this going to make us actually value and engage with the God of the universe because we need it? I think God's inviting us into a real relationship of prayer with Him. So the band's going to kick off and we're going to just pray, be with Him, and we're going to respond to this month, right? Let's not let this month go by without it making a change in us. Because God has something powerful to give to us if we're willing to wrestle and strain and actually engage with Him. So let's